Sergeant Marshall thought he had arrested just another arrogant black man. But within a few hours, his career would collapse, and the entire country would know his name. After all, he hadn't put handcuffs on just any driver. He had arrested the Attorney General. What happened next shocked even the most seasoned observers. But let's start from the very beginning. Sergeant Dan Marshall lazily stretched in his patrol car, glancing at the deserted road. The shift had been dull, and he was itching for some action. His gaze locked onto a black sedan moving just a little faster than the rest. The driver, a black man in an expensive suit, looked far too confident. Marshall smirked. He didn't like it when they acted as if the law didn't apply to them. "Got one," he muttered, flipping on his lights. The car obediently pulled over. The driver didn't look nervous, which annoyed Marshall. He strolled over, rapped on the window. "License and registration." The man handed over his documents without a word. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You were speeding," Marshall lied. The driver raised an eyebrow. "I was going 35 in a 40 zone. That tone. Marshall hated it when black men spoke to him like equals. He glanced inside the car. Spotless, no open containers, no drugs, no weapons. Damn. Step out of the vehicle. On what grounds? Don't make me use force, Marshall sneered, resting a hand on his cuffs. The man Eden got out. Hands on the hood. You're making a mistake, officer. Oh, I decide what's a mistake and what's not. Marshall spun him around, twisted his arm, and snapped the cuffs on. You're under arrest for resisting. The man didn't fight back, but as Marshall looked at him, a strange unease settled in his gut. That gaze, it wasn't fearful, more like assessing. You'll regret this. Marshall just laughed and led him toward the patrol car. He had no idea how prophetic those words would soon become. Marshall led the detainee down the precinct corridor with satisfaction. He loved this moment. The instant someone realized they were in real trouble. "Take a seat, boss," Marshall said mockingly, shoving the man onto a hard chair in the interrogation room. Derek sat upright, calmly crossing his arms. Unlike most detainees, he showed no anger, no panic. Only his eyes betrayed that he had already calculated something. "Name?" Marshall asked lazily as he began filling out the report. "Derek Williams." Marshall froze for a moment. The name sounded familiar, but he didn't give it much thought. "You act like you're special. Think that fancy suit impresses anyone?" Derek glanced at him with a faint smirk, but said nothing. That irritated Marshall. He was used to protests, to pleas for a phone call, to outraged yelling. But this silence, this made him uneasy. "Okay, Mr. Big Shot," Marshall scoffed and walked over to the duty desk. Officer Johnson was at the computer, entering the detainee's information. Suddenly, he stiffened, his eyes widening as if he had seen a ghost. "Oh shit, Dan. What?" "You just arrested the state attorney general." A cold knot formed in Marshall's stomach. "You're joking." Wordlessly, Johnson turned the screen. There, staring back at him, was Derek Williams' official government photo. Next to it in bold letters was his title, State Attorney General. Marshall's stomach churned. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. "Shit. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Johnson hissed. "That man oversees every police officer in this state. He fights corruption and abuse of power, and you just arrested him on a fake charge." Marshall swallowed hard. Maybe he won't make a big deal out of it. "Are you insane? Look outside." Marshall turned to the window and felt ice grip his spine. Journalists were already swarming the precinct entrance. Just then, the interrogation room door opened. Derek walked out. flanked by the lieutenant and the precinct chief. "Officer Marshall." The prosecutor's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "I suggest you find a good lawyer." He pulled a business card from his pocket and casually placed it on the desk beside a stunned Marshall. Oh, Derek leaned in slightly. "I will definitely be attending your hearing." Marshall couldn't utter a single word as the man he had so recklessly arrested walked out of the precinct. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions over one another, and in that moment, Marshall knew his career was over. The courtroom buzzed like a beehive. Journalists filled the rows, cameras clicked, and spectators whispered, discussing the scandalous case. No one could believe that a mere police officer had arrested the state attorney general. Sergeant Dan Marshall sat at the defense table, his face flushed with tension. He had been told this was just a formality, but deep down he knew something was off. The doors swung open, and in walked Derek Williams, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. He moved slowly, with dignity, as if he controlled the entire room. His mere presence silenced even the most skeptical onlookers. Marshall involuntarily tensed as Williams passed by and took his seat at the prosecution's table. Their eyes met. There was no anger in the prosecutor's gaze, just cold calculation. "Court is now in session," the judge announced, stepping into the room. "We are here today for the case of the unlawful arrest of Derek Williams by Officer Daniel Marshall." Marshall swallowed hard. Prosecutor Williams stood. "Your Honor, I request that this trial be fully public and transparent. Let the people see how the system works." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The first piece of evidence was the arrest video. The courtroom screen lit up, showing Marshall demanding that Williams exit the vehicle without cause before slapping handcuffs on him. The journalists murmured. The audience gasped. "Officer Marshall, you claimed I resisted arrest. Do you see any resistance in this footage?" Williams asked, his gaze fixed on the cop. Marshall's throat went dry. "Well, not exactly. You fabricated the charges." "I was just doing my job," Marshall blurted out, instantly realizing his mistake. The judge banged the gavel. "Order in the court." Williams continued, his voice unwavering. "The truth is, Sergeant, you are a product of a system that has shielded police misconduct for years. Today, this courtroom isn't just deciding your fate, it's deciding the fate of many who have suffered from injustice." Marshall clenched his fists but remained silent. An hour later, the judge delivered the ruling. "Officer Marshall, you are hereby suspended from duty, and a criminal case for abuse of power is being opened against you." Marshall felt the ground disappear beneath him. He had lost. Without sparing him a glance, Williams stood and exited the courtroom. The scandal was only beginning. 2 weeks had passed since the trial. Sergeant Dan Marshall sat in his smoke-filled apartment, staring at the TV. "Police scandal, racist arrest of the Attorney General," the anchor announced, as his face appeared next to Derek Williams. "Son of a bitch," he muttered, reaching for a bottle of whiskey. He thought the system would protect him. But once the case went public, everyone turned away. The next day, his badge no longer worked at the station. "Sergeant, you're suspended." The receptionist avoided his gaze. "You know this is politics. I was just doing my job. Orders from above, Dan. They want you at headquarters." Fall from grace. At headquarters, the police commissioner and lawyers were waiting. "Sergeant Marshall, you're under internal investigation." Marshall exhaled sharply. "Because of that damn Williams?" The commissioner shook his head. "Not just that. We reviewed your past cases. Complaints, violations, video evidence. You drew too much attention, Dan. We can't ignore it anymore. You're throwing me away like garbage? You're toxic now. The police need a new image. Marshall felt his world collapse. I've served 20 years and used the system for 20 years. Now it won't protect you. Charges filed. Week later, he was charged with excessive force, false reports, systematic discrimination. His lawyer was blunt. Dan, this is serious. Plead guilty, take a deal. You'll get probation but lose your badge forever. I won't plead guilty. The lawyer slid a phone across the table. On screen, Marshall's own voice played. They're always hiding something. Keep them scared. This is a setup. No, Dan, just consequences. The final verdict. The trial was public. Cameras caught every second. Marshall sat, fists clenched, avoiding the crowd's gaze. When the judge entered, everyone stood. Daniel Marshall, the court finds you guilty on all counts. You're barred from law enforcement and sentenced to 3 years of probation. The crowd murmured. Some clapped. Marshall stared at the floor. He had lost. But the worst part? Derek Williams watching him. No anger, no triumph. Just cold satisfaction. In the hallway, they met face to face. Happy now? Marshall growled. Williams adjusted his cuffs. Justice has prevailed, Sergeant. Go to hell. The system didn't break, Marshall. It just doesn't work for you anymore. He walked away, leaving Marshall with his shattered illusions. Outside, reporters celebrated Justice's victory.